Well, we have here Peter Moore, Managing Director of Radio Caroline. Welcome, Peter. What we want to do is to talk about the last year. It's 12 months ago you've been in Holland for the first time, and since then a lot has happened.
That's right.
First of all, it was April last year, there was a special event in Dover.
Yeah, that's right. For the last birthday, the 28th birthday, we thought we ought to be on the air by some means or the other. And as you may know, it's possible in England to buy a license for 1 month for about £2,000. So we broadcast for 28 days to Dover, although luckily the signal got into France quite well, and in addition we got some advertisers there. And we made a reasonable profit, though mostly from people coming to see the ship rather than just placing advertising. So at that stage we were quite confident, but unfortunately things didn't continue as well as that after the Dover broadcast, I'm afraid.
During that period you could be heard also on Spectrum and QAFM. Tell me something about this link up with QAFM.
Well, we've had various tries at satellite broadcasting. The first one was when Chris Carey, who was a Caroline employee of the 70s and then went on to do many other things in radio, offered us 3 months airtime on a thing he called Radio Nova. And Nova was a satellite station which replaced an Irish AM station which he ran quite successfully. Now he was going to close Nova down, but he had 3 months airtime left over, and he offered that to us as a favour. But unfortunately, Chris being a rather unusual businessman, it wasn't more than a few days before he thought, well, perhaps this is going very well having Radio Caroline on my satellite, perhaps I might like to keep it going for myself. So on that basis we were obliged to withdraw, but that was our first go at satellite. Then we met the people from QEFM, which is another UK satellite station, and we bought such airtime as we could afford, which was only midnight till 4 in the morning, which obviously is not a very peak time. And unfortunately we were outbid on that by another organisation, but then QEFM went out of business, so that was the end of that one. We were briefly back on 558 because we went to the station Spectrum, who took over our frequency, and told them it would be a nice gesture to give us a couple of hours just to show how magnanimous they are. So we were on Spectrum 558 for a short while. And currently, and I don't know where the gentleman is, Mr. Hank de Jong, who runs his station RNI from Norway, has given us quite free, ever since November when we went aground, nightly programmes on his station RNI, for which we're very grateful. So if people would like to thank him for his generosity, I'd be very pleased.
Last year there were the first talks with Martin Roman from the OCD here in Haarlem. A lot of talks have been since then.
Yeah, I'm sorry Martin Roman isn't here today actually. He's a very unusual man. A year ago today I met him, and he suggested that there was a complex means by where he could sell our equipment at public auction and give us the money. But that seemed rather complicated, so after much negotiation he finally agreed that we could have it all back, the only stipulation being that we pay our own transport. And we thought the best time would be after the 1st of January 93, when the border controls in Europe were meant to cease. So on February the 19th, aided by SMC, who paid the ferry costs, we drove over to a warehouse near Rotterdam, picked up all the equipment, took it back, and it's now back in place on the ship. So the ship looks, internally at least, just the way it did before it was raided in 1989.
Will all the equipment rebuilt in the ship?
Yeah, I mean the enthusiasm was such that we got back to the boat at around midnight on the 19th of February, and then I went to bed because I'd been up for about a day and a half. And when I woke up in the morning, everyone put the ship back together. Surprisingly, most of the equipment still worked. There was some damage, obviously, because the valves and other things hadn't been properly packed. But mostly, it had been stored in good, dry conditions, and apart from some peripheral damage, it all works quite nicely. So the 3 studios are complete again, and the God Studio and various other bits and pieces. We haven't as yet reassembled the transmitters because we thought perhaps that might be pushing our luck just a little bit.
What was Ronan's reaction on the DTI proposal?
Ronan? Well, Ronan doesn't trust Ronan doesn't trust authority, and with good reason. But he was quite prepared to let me negotiate at my own peril. But he's happy enough that the goods are back. The goods are back on board. Peter Chicago, our engineer, was rather of the opinion that we should symbolically leave them and not collect them. But the people who pay to keep the ship intact would like to see it complete. So on their behalf, we thought we'd better get all the material and put it back on the ship, which we have now done.
There were rumors that there were talks with Sky organization about 24-hour satellite transponder.
Well, interesting point. Everybody wants us to be on satellite, but there isn't a UK satellite broadcaster that's ever made a success of it. As I said before, QEFM went out of business with debts of about £250,000, and then formed a new company, went back into business the next day. The other English specialist satellite station, Euronet, closed down in early March. We were just about to sign a deal with them to take every Sunday, but just as we signed the papers, they closed down, so that's another setback. But yeah, we would love to be on satellite. It's a pure matter of £110,000 a year for a transponder. And one of the problems is, of course, with satellite radio, there are no audience figures. So a satellite broadcaster can't prove whether he's got one listener or a million. So QEFM concocted their listening figures, which vary between 5.7 and 12.8 million listeners according to which day of the week you ask them. Euronet are more realistic, and they reckon they were reaching about 400,000 listeners. But Sky themselves say that in England there's no future currently for a satellite broadcaster just reaching into people's homes, being received on their dishes. It's only going to be viable if you can persuade other stations, conventional stations, to take their output and retransmit it. And that's the basis on which Nova was set up. But it didn't work for them, and it really hasn't worked for anyone else so far. But obviously Caroline, being Caroline, could do things far more cheaply than most people. But there's no avoiding this £110,000 a year for the transponder. And in fact, what I'll mention in a minute is a magazine we've started to produce where we pose that very question, saying, well, if you'd like us back on satellite, how much are you prepared to help? But I'll come back to that in a minute.
How's it going with the American projects on the shortwave?
Well, what can I say? Al Weiner, who briefly ran Radio New York International, which was an offshore station, he came over to England in the 80s and learnt his art on the Ross, and then went back to America and purchased his ship Sarah and fitted it out. I don't know how come he only lasted such a short length of time. I think it had something to do with trying to register his ship in Sealand, which some of you might know is just an offshore fort off the coast of Harwich, which purports to be an independent territory, but obviously nobody officially recognises it. But anyway, he maintained something of his station, Radio New York, by hiring airtime on a big shortwave station. And once again, in the same way as Hank has given us some airtime, Al's given us a short period each week for a news programme. But he's now ended his involvement with the shortwave station to work on what I can only really say is a more interesting project. So we're not on the air at the moment in cooperation with Al, but we may well be in the future.
Were there many people writing to the Caroline organization after the Christmas programs on the satellite?
Basically no. That's why we think that there just isn't that much of an audience. When we began our shortwave transmissions from Ireland, which is another thing we can talk about in a minute, we started to receive mail within 2 days of the first broadcast. And the mail we get from that still far exceeds any response we ever had from satellite. So what that indicates, I wouldn't like to say. I can only tell you what we found.
Tell us more about Ireland.
All right. Well, the Irish situation legally is unclear. There were, as you may know, any number of Irish commercial pirates operating quite openly. and then they were mostly forced to shut. Then I think one station, Radio Dublin, who are more durable than the most, challenged the legislation, and it was decided that stations which had been in operation before the law was changed could properly return to the air, and so that's why they restarted transmissions, and so did Radio Fax, which is another shortwave outlet run by an English firm. And there are some spare transmitters over there, and one of them belongs to a gentleman who rents us 2 days a week, Saturday and Sunday, on 6295, and shortly on in the 75 metre band too. I mean, the reception is not outstanding, but it's there. From time to time you can hear it reasonably well.
So the ship is still in Dover. Are there plans for the future to get out of Dover Harbour finally?
We very much like to get out of Dover. I mean, what's basically happened, when the boat came in after being shipwrecked, there was some question as to who had authority over it. But we now, I think when I was here last year, we were in the process of raising the money for the salvage operation, which we paid before the Dover broadcast, and that was £20,000. Since then, we've been incurring costs of about £1,000 a month just to tie the boat up in Dover Harbour. And we've been there for about 15 months now, so you can see what it must have cost us. Plus, of course, the cost of fuel, because we still need diesel, we still have tenders, although they drive alongside these days. We have improved the condition of the ship remarkably, because when it was brought in, it was in a sorry state. The central heating now works, the air conditioning blowers work, a lot of the machinery which didn't work is now functional. We hope by Easter to bring down from the north of England our previous chief engineer, the ship's engineer, who worked on the ship when it was a trawler, and get the main engine running as a sort of Easter present. Then we have to think about, can we fix the steering gear, which was badly damaged when the boat went aground. But by one thing at a time, and get the engine running, I'm sure that will give everybody a bit of a morale boost.
How is Ronan going nowadays? Do we meet him still at a cricket match?
Ronan? That's a leading question. Well, without Ronan we wouldn't have any of this. On the other hand, 29 years have passed, and it's rather difficult to expect him to be as enthusiastic as he once was. No doubt at the proper time, when there's a media opportunity, which he's so good at, he'll reappear. In the meantime, he keeps in touch from time to time. Sometimes he's in Ireland with his parents, and his father particularly is very old now, he's in his mid-80s. Sometimes he's in Chelsea, historically, cruising the King's Road, and mostly he's in Paris. But you know, he's fit and well, and no doubt he'll reappear at the proper time.
You can still use people who want to work on a ship forthcoming summer months?
Oh yeah, any number of people. You see, as with the satellite, you can cut costs down to a certain point, but there's always the cost of the transponder. With the boat, we can keep our costs right down, apart from the fact we have to pay the moorings, we have to buy diesel. But any other materials or labour which we can scrounge for free, we'll certainly accept. So if someone does want to play with a radio ship this summer, you'd be my guest. Just make the arrangements, and we'll be pleased to see you.
Maybe there are questions from the audience which you want to answer, Peter.
Heeft iemand vragen?
Yeah, sure. If anybody wants to ask a question? No? No? All right. Well, listen. A couple of things I'd like to mention. As you know, out in the lobby are some of these leaflets, which I'd be grateful if you take away with you. They sort of explain how we fund the operation. One is the support group, which we set up towards the end of 1990, where people pay a token amount each month, and that's used to pay our moorings and all the other costs of the ship. In return for joining this association, we send a monthly magazine. This is the 4th issue we've done so far. There are not a lot of copies out there, but there are some if you'd like to have a look. So that's one way of helping us, which we would appreciate. Tony Kirk, one of our disc jockeys, restarted the Radio Caroline Club. He found a very old copy of a 70s magazine called Caroline Newsbeat and decided to revive Caroline Newsbeat, and that's what this is. So if you don't feel inclined to join the support group, you could join his listeners club, and that's another way of getting this magazine. And of course the merchandising that keeps us going. I bought a dozen books over here today and they lasted about 5 minutes. Rob sold them all. But all the profits from the book once again go into the support group and therefore into the ship. And Horizon Sales is a sales organisation, and everything in their catalogue, which is quite extensive, goes to the ship. They don't take any profit themselves. So that is how we just about scrape by. There's a premium service phone line which really isn't a lot of use on the continent, where we give weekly news updates, but the news can be gained historically by subscribing to this magazine. So if you consider doing any of those things, like without having to really inconvenience yourself greatly, you could do an awful lot for us.
Really, getting back to that magazine, what I told you, it might be of interest to them to know that at the time that was originally published, it was outlawed.
Oh yeah, the original Caroline Newsweek was an illegal publication because of the fact it's illegal. To promote Caroline, one interesting thing, there's a television station in hoping to introduce, could actually be the Marine Offences Act, because they explain that it shall be illegal for an English company to advertise on Red Hot Dutch. They explain it should be illegal for an English person to work for Red Hot Dutch. It's an offence to support or promote it, and it should become an offence in satellite magazines to describe the programmes and their frequency and when they're transmitted. So really we have the sort of Satellite Offences Act coming along. The thing about Red Hot Dutch, they have something that we don't have. They've got money. So they've taken the government to the High Court on Friday, and I think they're planning to serve an injunction on our Minister of Heritage to see if they can't stop this nonsense. I see someone there has an advertisement for it. And I think if they one could be hopeful if they overturn this legislation, it might possibly call into question some other legislation which we weren't able to do anything about. At least they haven't tried to use the armed forces against Red Hot Dutch as yet. If they did, I think they'd probably come off the worst, because I've met some of the people that run it. But anyway, as you see, no one minds about Red Hot Dutch, but someone's decided it's not a good thing, and really that's the story of our lives, isn't it?